The first time I realized my marriage was already over, it wasn't during the affair, or the missing money, or even the day my name disappeared from the farm deed. It was the moment my husband handed me a cup of coffee across our kitchen table and said almost kindly, "You should stop asking questions. It's not your strength." Before we go any further, if stories about family betrayal, revenge, and quiet payback hit close to home for you, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I read every one. My name is Claire Holloway. I was 32 years old when my life collapsed so neatly it almost looked intentional. I owned a working cattle and hay farm in eastern Kansas, or at least I thought I did. The land had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather bought the first 200 acres after returning from Korea. My father expanded it slowly, one fence line at a time. When he died unexpectedly, when I was 24, the farm passed to me. Not as a gift, but as a responsibility. I ran it myself. Bookkeeping at night, feeding at dawn contracts, negotiated over chipped mugs at the kitchen counter. By the time I was 28, the farm cleared just over $1.4 million in annual revenue. Not glamorous, but steady, honest. That's when I married Daniel Holloway. Daniel liked to tell people he saved me from drowning in work. He said it with a smile, always with his arm around my shoulders, like he was joking. He wasn't. Daniel came from money, old local money. His mother, Margaret Holloway, made sure everyone knew it. She lived 15 minutes away in a white farmhouse that looked decorative instead of functional, like it had never seen mud. From the beginning, Margaret treated the farm like a temporary inconvenience, something that would eventually be sold, leveraged, or corrected. "Claire works too hard," she used to say at Sunday dinners, swirling her wine. "It's not feminine." Daniel never contradicted her. He'd just squeeze my knee under the table, a warning disguised as affection. The first small thing happened in our second year of marriage. A loan document appeared in our mailbox, a short-term operating loan for equipment upgrades, signed by Daniel. I hadn't seen it before. When I asked him, he looked confused, then amused. "I thought I told you. Mom's accountant said it was smart. You trust me, right?" The amount wasn't small, $85,000. I told myself it was fine. I told myself marriage meant shared decisions. I told myself not to be controlling. That's how it starts, with reasonable lies. The second thing was subtler. Margaret began helping with finances. She framed it as support. "You're too close to it, Claire. Let family help." Family meant her. Suddenly, statements were rerouted. Meetings happened without me. Daniel would summarize afterward, always vaguely. "Everything's fine. You worry too much." I noticed my access to accounts shrinking. Not disappearing, just delayed. Passwords changed. Notifications turned off. When I pushed back, Daniel's tone shifted. "You're acting paranoid. This is why Mom says you're difficult." That word, difficult. It followed me everywhere. The farm hands noticed before I did. Payments delayed. Repairs postponed. Vendors asking questions I couldn't answer. One afternoon, while checking inventory, I found a transfer I didn't recognize. $200,000 moved to a holding company I'd never heard of. When I confronted Daniel that night, Margaret was already sitting at our kitchen table. I hadn't invited her. She didn't look up from her tea. "Claire, this isn't your area of expertise," she said calmly. "Daniel and I are restructuring for tax efficiency." "For whose benefit?" I asked. She finally met my eyes. "For the family." I realized then that I wasn't included in her definition. Daniel stood behind her, arms crossed, watching me like I was a problem to be managed. That night, I slept in the guest room. 2 weeks later, my younger sister Emily came to visit. Emily was 4 years younger than me, softer, always drifting. She had bounced between jobs, cities, and boyfriends for years. I let her stay whenever she needed. She arrived with 2 suitcases, and a smile that felt rehearsed. "Just for a few weeks," she said. "I need a reset." Daniel was unusually attentive that evening, offering wine, laughing too loudly. Margaret called twice. I noticed the way Emily watched Daniel when she thought I wasn't looking, the way he didn't correct it. Still, I said nothing. That was my mistake. The public humiliation came at the county agricultural banquet in early spring, an event Daniel insisted we attend. He stood on stage during a panel discussion and thanked his mother for helping him take over farm operations. Take over. People clapped. I sat in the audience, smiling politely, my hands numb. Afterward, a local banker congratulated Daniel on the transition. Transition from what I asked. Daniel didn't answer. Margaret did. "You've done so much, Claire. Now it's time to rest." That was the moment I understood something irreversible had already happened. I went home that night and opened every file I still had access to. What I found wasn't chaos. It was planning. The farm deed had been transferred into a trust. My name wasn't on it. The accounts were nearly empty, and my sister's phone was charging on Daniel's side of the bed. I didn't scream. I didn't confront anyone. I sat on the edge of the mattress and felt something settle inside my chest. Heavy, clear. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had decided I wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. And as I stared at the screen, lighting up with a message from Emily, I understood something else. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the moment I stopped being generous with people who mistook silence for permission. The hardest part about betrayal isn't the shock. It's realizing how long it's been happening while you were busy being reasonable. The morning after the banquet, I woke up before sunrise, like I always did. Habit is stubborn that way. I pulled on my boots, stepped outside, and let the cold Kansas air burn my lungs until my thoughts slowed down. The cattle didn't care who owned the deed. They needed feed. The fence line still needed checking. The land didn't know it had been stolen. That grounded me. I finished my rounds, came back inside, and poured coffee. Daniel was already awake, scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. "You're up early," he said casually. I looked at him for a long second. "I always am." He smiled, the smile he used when he thought things were settled. "I'm heading into town with Mom today. Bank stuff." I nodded. "Drive safe." He hesitated, like he expected more. A question, an argument, a plea. When I gave him none, something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, calculation. As soon as he left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened a notebook. Not the farm ledger, a new one. I wrote one sentence at the top of the page. Assume nothing. Verify everything. I started with the trust. The document was clean, professionally drafted. It had been filed 6 months earlier. I recognized the law firm, a regional firm in Wichita that specialized in asset protection for family businesses. The settler was Margaret Holloway. The trustee was Daniel Holloway. The beneficiary was a holding company called Prairie North Agricultural LLC. I was nowhere. The farm I'd inherited outright had been folded into a structure that legally erased me, and it had been done while I was still signing checks and negotiating contracts like I owned the place. That took planning and consent. I checked the signature page. There it was, my signature, or something that looked like it. I felt a tight, cold focus take over. I pulled old documents and compared them side by side. The differences were small. Pressure points, slant, timing. Forgery isn't dramatic. It's precise. I photographed everything and backed it up to 3 locations. Then I called the first person who came to mind. Not a lawyer, a woman named Ruth Calder. Ruth was my father's former accountant, semi-retired, sharp as glass. She'd known the farm books longer than anyone. When I told her what I'd found, she didn't interrupt. "When I finished," she said, "Claire, I need you to listen carefully. Don't confront them. Not yet. That word again? Yet. There's a reason they moved quietly, Ruth continued. And if they're smart enough to plan this, they're smart enough to panic if they think you're onto them. I stared at the wall. What do I do? You let them believe they've won. I closed my eyes. I can do that. Over the next week, I played my role perfectly. I deferred. I smiled. I asked Daniel if he needed help. I let Margaret talk over me at dinners. I listened while she explained for the 10th time how business worked. Inside, I counted. Emily moved fully into the house. She started wearing my clothes, borrowing my truck, sitting too close to Daniel on the couch. One evening, I walked into the living room and found them laughing over a shared screen, their shoulders touching. Emily jumped back like she'd been burned. "Oh, hey, Claire." Daniel didn't move at all. "You okay?" he asked too casually. I smiled. "Fine." That night, I slept in the guest room again. Not because I was hurt, because I was done pretending this was a marriage. The next small loss came quietly. A letter from the cooperative informed me that the farm's voting rights had been reassigned. I called the number listed. The representative was apologetic. We were instructed by the account holder, Mr. Holloway. Account holder. When I hung up, I didn't cry. I made another note. They're accelerating. That meant something was coming. I found out what 3 days later. Margaret invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. She chose a restaurant in town that liked white tablecloths and hushed voices. Control thrives in polite spaces. "Claire," she said after ordering, "I want to be clear. None of this is personal." I stirred my water. "It never is when people say that." She smiled thinly. "You've always been capable, hardworking, but you don't have vision. Daniel does." I looked at her. Daniel can't tell alfalfa from haylage. She ignored that. The farm was never meant to be run emotionally. It needs structure, authority, and, frankly, a man at the helm. There it was. She leaned in slightly. "We'll make sure you're taken care of. A stipend, a place to stay. But you need to stop interfering." I set my fork down carefully. Interfering with what? With progress. I met her eyes and saw it clearly for the first time. She didn't see me as a threat. She saw me as a liability. When I got home, Daniel was waiting. "Mom said lunch went well." I nodded. "She's very clear." "Good." He exhaled, relieved. "We'll talk logistics soon. Maybe it's time you step back from operations." I tilted my head. Maybe. That answer made him smile. Later that night, I followed a hunch. Emily's door was closed. Light on. I walked past Daniel's office and saw his laptop open. Careless. An email chain was visible. Subject next phase. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to. One line was enough. Once Claire signs the separation agreement, we finalized the sale. Sale. They weren't just taking the farm. They were cashing it out. I took a photo, quietly closed the laptop, and went to bed. Lying in the dark, I felt something solid settle in my chest. Not rage. Resolve. They thought this was about money. They thought I would fold, accept a payout, disappear quietly. They had no idea I had already stopped seeing the farm as land. It was leverage. And I was done being generous with people who confused my patience for weakness. In the morning, I would make one call. Not to confront, not to beg, to prepare. Because once I moved, everything they'd built would collapse in a way they couldn't reverse. And they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. Preparation doesn't feel dramatic while you're doing it. It feels boring, methodical, lonely. That's how the next 3 weeks passed. I stayed calm on the surface and ruthless in private. I woke up early, worked the farm like I still owned it, and smiled when Daniel or Margaret spoke over me. At night, I documented everything. Every account change, every email reroute, every invoice signed without my authorization. Ruth Calder came by one afternoon under the excuse of reviewing old records. She sat at my kitchen table, glasses perched low on her nose, and didn't waste time. "They're stripping assets," she said quietly. "Not fast, but clean. "How much is left?" I asked. She gave me a look, the kind adults give children when the answer won't be kind. Liquid maybe 600,000, non-liquid much more, but it's all positioned for sale. My jaw tightened. "And the forged signature," she nodded. "It's good. Too good for amateurs. I have a guess who helped." "Who?" "A man named Thomas Renshaw, real estate attorney. Does a lot of family restructuring work with Margaret Holloway's social circle." The name landed hard. I'd met Thomas once, at a Christmas dinner at Margaret's house. He'd asked me questions about the farm that felt casual at the time. Curious, interested. He'd been mapping me. Ruth closed her folder. "You need your own counsel, not local, not friendly. And you need evidence of intent, not just damage." I nodded. I already had a name. 2 days later, I drove 3 hours west to meet Lena Morales, an agricultural litigation attorney based out of Garden City. She specialized in contested land transfers and spousal fraud. She didn't smile when I told my story. "Good," she said. "You waited." I raised an eyebrow. "Most people confront too early. They get emotional. The other side closes ranks. You didn't." She slid a yellow legal pad toward me. "We're going to do 3 things. First, we establish your original ownership and operational control. Second, we prove conspiracy. Third, we freeze the sale." "How?" Lena tapped her pen. "You need proof of coordination and proof of benefit." I thought of Emily. That night, I stopped pretending. I installed recording software on my phone, legal in Kansas, with one-party consent. I left it on when I walked into rooms. It didn't take long. The first recording came accidentally. Emily and Daniel were in the barn office. I'd forgotten my gloves and walked back quietly. Their voices carried through the open window. "This has to be soon," Emily said. "I can't keep pretending." Daniel laughed softly. "Once the sale goes through, everything changes." "For who?" she asked. "For us." I stood still, heart steady, and listened. "Mom's pushing the separation agreement," Daniel continued. "Claire will sign if we frame it right. She's tired, guilty. She won't fight." Emily hesitated. "And after we make it official. Just not until the money clears." I backed away silently. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was heartbroken, because I was recalculating. The next morning, I acted normal. Made breakfast. Asked Emily if she wanted coffee. She looked startled, then relieved. "You're being nice," she said. I smiled. "I've always been nice." She laughed. Nervous. Unaware she'd already lost. Over the next week, I gathered what Lena needed. Emails between Daniel and Thomas Renshaw. Texts between Emily and Margaret discussing timing. Calendar invites labeled finalization. I watched them prepare to erase me while asking me to help cook dinner. The separation agreement arrived on a Thursday. Daniel handed it to me like a peace offering. "This doesn't have to be ugly, Claire. Mom just wants things handled cleanly." I flipped through it slowly. They were offering me $75,000, a relocation allowance, a confidentiality clause. "You'd be set up," Daniel said. "Free. Free from what I asked. From all this." He gestured vaguely to the house. "The land. My life." I closed the folder. "I need time." "Of course," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need." He thought he was winning. That weekend, Margaret hosted a dinner. She invited neighbors, local investors, people with money and opinions. Daniel insisted I attend. "We need to present unity." Unity was her favorite word when she meant silence. At the table, Margaret raised her glass. "To family transitions," she said smoothly, "and new beginnings." Emily met my eyes briefly, then looked away. I raised my glass too, to clarity. No one noticed. After dessert, I stepped outside to breathe. Thomas Renshaw followed. "Beautiful night," he said. "It is." He leaned against the railing. "You've built something impressive here. It's a shame when things outgrow their original owners." I met his gaze. "Original owners don't disappear." He smiled thinly. "Sometimes they sign." That was enough. On Monday morning, Lena filed an emergency injunction. The sale froze at 9:14 a.m. At 9:22 a.m., Daniel's phone started ringing. At 9:30 a.m., Margaret drove to the house unannounced. At 9:47 a.m., Emily locked herself in her room. I sat at the kitchen table and poured coffee like it was any other day. Daniel stormed in. "What did you do?" I looked up calmly. I asked questions. Margaret arrived moments later, face flushed. "You ungrateful girl," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stood. "I protected my property." Daniel stared at me like he didn't recognize me. "You can't win this," he said. I tilted my head. "I already have." That was the moment the power shifted. Not because they were afraid, because they realized I had stopped needing their permission. Lena called an hour later. "They're panicking," she said. "That's good. Panic makes mistakes." "What's next?" I asked. Now she replied, "We let them explain themselves under oath." I looked out the window at the fields. My fields. The land didn't belong to whoever spoke the loudest. It belonged to whoever knew how to defend it. And in the next chapter, they would learn that silence wasn't my weakness. It was the space where I'd been planning their collapse all along. Panic makes people careless. That was the first thing Lena Morales warned me about when the injunction hit. The second was simpler. Let them talk. They talked immediately. Daniel paced the house like it was shrinking. He slammed drawers, made calls in half whispers, and avoided my eyes, like I carried something contagious. Margaret arrived twice in one day, both times, without calling, both times convinced she could still reassert control by volume alone. Emily stayed locked in her room. I stayed boring. I cooked meals. I checked fences. I answered emails from vendors with polite, neutral updates. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I didn't negotiate. The injunction meant the sale was frozen. It also meant discovery was coming. And discovery is where stories go to die. Lena scheduled depositions for the following week. Daniel first, then Margaret, then Thomas Renshaw. Emily was listed as a material witness. When Daniel got the notice, he laughed. "Too loud. This is just posturing," he said. "Mom's lawyer will squash it." Margaret nodded sharply. "We've done nothing illegal." I said nothing. The night before Daniel's deposition, he knocked on the guest room door where I'd been sleeping for months. "Claire," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Talk." He ran a hand through his hair, the way he did when he wanted sympathy. "This is spiraling. If we just settle this privately, we can both walk away without destroying each other." I tilted my head. "You already destroyed the marriage." He flinched. "I'm talking about money, reputation." I smiled faintly. "I'm talking about truth." He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You really think you can outmaneuver my mother?" I held his gaze. "I don't have to. I just have to outlast her." He left without another word. The deposition room was small and aggressively neutral. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a long table with microphones and water pitchers that no one touched. Daniel sat across from me, flanked by his attorney, a man named Scott Elridge, who looked exhausted already. Margaret sat behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight. Lena sat beside me, calm and prepared. The court reporter swore Daniel in. Lena started gently. "State your full name for the record." "Daniel Holloway." "You are married to Claire Holloway?" "Yes." "Were you aware that the farm property was transferred into a trust 6 months ago?" "Yes." "Did you obtain your wife's informed consent for that transfer?" Daniel hesitated, just long enough. "Yes." Lena slid a document across the table. "Is that your wife's signature?" Daniel glanced down. "Yes." Lena didn't raise her voice. "Can you describe the circumstances under which she signed it?" Daniel shifted in his chair. "It was during a busy period. She trusted me." Lena nodded. "Where was she when she signed?" "At home." "Which room?" "The kitchen." "What time of day?" Daniel looked at his attorney. Scott didn't help him. "Afternoon," Daniel said. Lena leaned back. "Claire, Do you recall signing this document? I met Daniel's eyes. No. Silence filled the room. Lena continued. Mr. Holloway, can you produce any communication in which your wife acknowledged this transfer? Daniel swallowed. Not specifically. Margaret scoffed. This is ridiculous. Lena turned to her. Mrs. Holloway, you'll have your turn. Daniel's deposition ended badly. He contradicted himself twice, forgot dates, referred to our decision when asked to specify whose decision it had been. Margaret went next. She was sharper, more practiced. But arrogance has a rhythm. Mrs. Holloway? Lena asked. Did you initiate the trust? Yes. Why? To protect the farm from mismanagement. Lena nodded. What mismanagement? Margaret paused. Emotional decision-making. Lack of scale. Lena slid another document forward. Are you aware this trust was positioned for sale within 90 days of formation? Margaret's lips tightened. That was a possibility that would have removed your daughter-in-law entirely. Margaret looked at me then. Really looked. Claire had her chance. Lena didn't flinch. Mrs. Holloway, are you aware that your son and your niece were engaged in an extramarital relationship during this restructuring? Margaret's head snapped around. What? Daniel went pale. Emily, sitting in the hallway, stood abruptly. Her chair scraped loud enough to be heard inside. Margaret turned back to Lena. That's irrelevant. It's not, Lena said. It speaks to intent. Margaret said nothing after that. Thomas Renshaw was last. He was careful. He chose his words like he was diffusing a bomb. But paper doesn't lie when it stacks up. Emails, calendar invites, drafts labeled Claire exit. When Lena played the recording of Thomas advising Daniel to control the signature window, his composure cracked. That afternoon, the judge extended the injunction. The sale was frozen indefinitely. Assets were ordered to remain untouched. The farm was placed under temporary joint oversight, pending further review. Daniel slammed his fist on the table when he heard. This is insane. Margaret didn't say a word. Back at the house, the air changed. Emily packed a bag that night. She didn't look at me as she passed through the kitchen. I didn't stop her. Daniel slept on the couch. Margaret stopped coming over. The farmhands started asking questions again. I answered them honestly. Nothing is changing. Keep doing your jobs. They did. A week later, Lena called me into her office. We have leverage now, she said. Real leverage. I nodded. But leverage only matters if you use it correctly. She smiled slightly. That's why I like you. She laid out the options. Divorce proceedings with fault. Civil fraud charges. Criminal referral for forgery. You don't have to pull every lever, she said. Just the right ones. I thought about Margaret's face when the affair came up. About Daniel's certainty that I'd disappear quietly. About Emily's relief when she left, like she'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. I made my choice. File for divorce, sue for full restoration of the farm, and refer the forgery to the state. No settlement, no silence. Lena nodded. They'll fight. I met her eyes. Let them. That night, I walked the perimeter fence alone. The sky was clear. The land was steady beneath my boots. This farm had survived droughts, floods, bad markets. It would survive this. And in the next chapter, they would learn something they'd never considered. I wasn't trying to ruin them. I was taking back what they never had the right to touch. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. The first subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered, heavy enough to feel symbolic. Daniel stared at it like it was written in another language. This is excessive, he said. You're enjoying this. I didn't answer. Enjoyment had nothing to do with it. What I felt was alignment. The law was finally moving at the same pace as the truth. Margaret called an emergency meeting that afternoon. She didn't invite me. She didn't need to. I was already there, sitting at the far end of the kitchen table, flipping through invoices Daniel no longer bothered to hide. Scott Elridge arrived with a leather briefcase and the tired look of a man realizing too late that he'd misjudged the other side. We need to talk strategy, Scott said, glancing at me. Privately. No, I said. Publicly is fine. Margaret bristled. This is still a family matter. I looked at her. You made it a legal one. Silence followed. Scott cleared his throat. The forgery referral complicates things, he said carefully. If the state pursues it, they will, Lena said from the doorway. She walked in like she belonged there. Because she did. Scott stiffened. Miss Morales, Counsel Lena replied. She set a folder on the table. The handwriting expert's preliminary report is back. The signature does not match Claire Holloway's known exemplars. Daniel's face drained of color. Margaret sat very still. Scott exhaled slowly. We should discuss settlement. Lena shook her head. There will be no settlement until full restoration of ownership and damages are addressed. Margaret's voice was sharp. You're turning my son into a criminal. Lena didn't blink. Your son made that choice himself. The meeting ended badly. Daniel slammed the door on his way out. Margaret stayed seated, staring at the table, like it had personally offended her. When she finally looked at me, her expression wasn't angry. It was incredulous. You're willing to burn everything down. I stood. No, I'm willing to let it burn if that's what honesty requires. She laughed once, bitter. You think you're strong because you found a lawyer. I leaned closer. I'm strong because I stopped asking you to see me. That was the last conversation we ever had alone. The divorce filing went through 3 days later. Fault-based, adultery, financial abuse, fraud. The local paper picked it up quietly. Not front page, just a column. The kind people read closely. Daniel Holloway, local agribusiness figure, named in contested divorce, involving alleged asset misappropriation. Margaret called me that night, voice trembling with fury. Do you know what this will do to us? I thought about the farmhands who hadn't been paid on time, the vendors who'd been lied to. The land nearly sold out from under me. I do, I said. She hung up. Emily tried once. She emailed me a long message filled with apologies that circled responsibility without landing on it. I didn't respond. Some bridges don't collapse. They dissolve. The hearings moved fast after that. The judge ordered a forensic audit of all farm-related accounts over the past 18 months. Independent, court-appointed. The auditor was a man named Gregory Pike. Meticulous, unimpressed by charm. He spent 3 days on site. Asked questions Daniel couldn't answer. Cross-reference transfers, Margaret insisted, were routine. On the 4th day, he pulled me aside. You were systematically excluded, he said. This wasn't sloppiness. It was design. I nodded. I know. The report was damning. Funds diverted, assets reclassified, loans taken without disclosure, a clear pattern of intent to remove me from ownership prior to liquidation. Daniel's attorney requested a continuance. Denied. Margaret's attorney requested mediation. Denied. The forgery charge moved forward quietly. Not public yet, but real. Daniel stopped coming home. He stayed with Margaret. Then, somewhere else. The house felt lighter. One evening, as I was closing the barn, Daniel showed up unannounced. He looked smaller, thinner. You could stop this, he said. You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. I leaned against the fence. It wasn't. He stepped closer. We were married. Yes. Doesn't that count for anything? I met his eyes. It counted. That's why this hurts. He looked away. Emily didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't laugh. Neither did you stop her. He swallowed. Mom said you'd ruin us. I shook my head. I'm not ruining you. I'm refusing to disappear for you. He left without another word. 2 weeks later, the preliminary ruling came down. The trust was deemed invalid. The farm was ordered restored to my sole ownership pending final judgment. Daniel was ordered to vacate the property. Margaret was barred from acting in any advisory capacity. I stood in the courtroom and listened as the judge read the order in a flat, procedural voice. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt corrective. Outside, Lena shook my hand. This isn't over, she said, but the ground is yours again. I exhaled. Good. That night, I walked the fields alone. The moon was high. The cattle lowed softly in the distance. The land felt unchanged, patient. I thought about how close I'd come to losing it because I wanted peace more than clarity. That wouldn't happen again, but I also knew this wasn't the end. Because people like Margaret don't accept loss quietly, and people like Daniel don't know who they are without something to control. They would try one more thing, something desperate, something public, and when they did, they wouldn't be facing the woman they thought they'd erased. They'd be facing someone who no longer needed to be kind to be strong. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, there would be no confusion about who owned what, or who was finally finished. Desperation doesn't look like anger. It looks like performance. Margaret chose the stage carefully. It happened the week before Thanksgiving, when attention is already divided and people are primed for nostalgia. She invited extended family to her house, cousins I hadn't seen in years, church friends, old donors to the county fair board, people who knew just enough about the farm to believe they were entitled to opinions. I wasn't invited. I found out when a neighbor texted me, "Your mother-in-law's telling a wild story tonight." I didn't ask which one. The next morning, my phone started buzzing. Aunt Linda wanted to know if I was okay. A former vendor asked if the farm was being seized. Someone forwarded me a Facebook post I'd been blocked from seeing. Margaret Holloway had written a long, carefully worded statement. It never mentioned fraud, or forgery, or adultery. It talked about heartbreak, about a young woman who had been overwhelmed by responsibility and led astray by opportunistic advisors, about a son who was doing his best to preserve a legacy, and about me. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. I was described as unstable, emotionally compromised, vindictive. The comments filled quickly. Praying for your family. So sad when money tears people apart. Hope Claire gets help. That word again. Help. I read it once. Then I closed the app. Lena called an hour later. She went public, Lena said. That changes things. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. You have two options, Lena continued. You ignore it and let it burn out. Or you respond once, cleanly, with facts. Which one wins? I asked. Lena didn't hesitate. The second one, but only if you're willing to be done after. I thought about the years I'd swallowed my voice to keep peace. The way silence had been mistaken for consent. Let's do it, I said. We responded that afternoon, not on Facebook, through filings. Lena released a summary of the court's preliminary findings to the local paper. No commentary, no emotion, just documented facts. Invalid trust, forged signature under investigation. Affair corroborated by sworn testimony. Court-ordered restoration of ownership. The article ran below the fold. It didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to exist. The comments stopped. Margaret didn't post again. Instead, Emily showed up. She pulled into the driveway just after dusk, her old car coughing as it stopped. I watched from the porch as she got out, slowly, hands shaking. I didn't invite her in. She stood at the bottom step, eyes red. I didn't know she was going to do that, Emily said. I didn't answer. She hugged herself. She told people you were unwell, that you'd turned on them. I tried to stop her. I looked at her then. When? Emily swallowed. After the injunction, she said if people believed you were unstable, the court might reconsider. That landed hard. I took a breath. And you stayed. Emily's voice cracked. I didn't know how to leave. I believed her. That didn't change anything. You can't fix this, I said quietly. She nodded. I know. She hesitated, then added, I'm pregnant. I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel's? She nodded. He doesn't know yet. I studied her face. Younger than me. Always had been. I hope you find your footing, Emily, I said. Truly. But it won't be here. She wiped her face. I didn't expect it to be. She left without another word. Thanksgiving came anyway. I spent it with Ruth Calder, and her husband. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer advice. They ate what I cooked and talked about weather and cattle prices and a broken gate they were fixing on their own land. It was perfect. The following week, the criminal referral became official. The state charged Daniel with felony forgery and financial fraud. Margaret wasn't charged. Not yet. But she was named repeatedly in affidavits. Daniel was arrested quietly on a Thursday morning. No handcuffs on TV, no sirens, just a booking photo that made its way online by evening. He looked confused in it. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt finality. Margaret called me that night. Her voice sounded smaller. "You've made your point," she said. "This has gone far enough." I let the silence stretch. "What do you want?" she asked. I answered honestly. "Nothing." She inhaled sharply. "Then why won't you stop?" "Because stopping is something you should have done." She hung up. The judge scheduled the final hearing for early January. The farm was already operating fully under my control again. Vendors paid, accounts transparent, staff reassured. The land responded the way it always did to stability. It produced. One evening, Lena and I sat in her office going over the last details. "You're going to win," she said. "Fully." I nodded. "But winning doesn't mean they disappear," she added. "It just means they don't get to touch you anymore." That was enough. As I drove home that night, the sky wide and dark over the fields, I felt something loosen that I'd been holding tight for years. Not anger, vigilance. I didn't need to watch my back anymore. But I also knew this wasn't over for them. The final hearing would force everything into the open. Every lie, every transfer, every choice. And when that happened, there would be no more stories Margaret could tell to soften the truth. There would only be records. And records don't care who raised their voice first. They only care who signed. In the next chapter, the courtroom would do what kitchens and bedrooms never could. It would name things accurately. And once that happens, there's no rewriting the ending. Courtrooms have a way of stripping people down. No furniture to hide behind. No tone to soften intent. Just words, dates, signatures. The final hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in January. Snow along the roads, fields frozen stiff. The kind of cold that makes everything brittle. Daniel arrived with the public defender this time. Scott Elridge had withdrawn quietly after the criminal charges were filed. Margaret sat 2 rows back. Rigid hands, folded chin high like posture could still save her. Emily wasn't there. I noticed that first. Lena sat beside me, calm as ever. She slid a notepad across the table. "No surprises today," she whispered. "Just facts." The judge, Honorable William Hargreave, entered at 9 sharp. No theatrics. He looked tired in the way people who've seen too much dishonesty tend to look. We began with the audit. Gregory Pike took the stand. He didn't embellish. He didn't editorialize. He spoke in numbers. $2.3 million diverted through intermediary accounts. 17 unauthorized transfers. 1 forged signature used repeatedly. He described the process like he was explaining gravity. Margaret's attorney tried to interrupt. "Objection, speculation." "Overruled," the judge said flatly. "Continue." Daniel's attorney tried a different angle. "Isn't it true that Mr. Holloway believed he had implicit authority as a spouse?" Gregory didn't blink. "Authority isn't implicit in account access. It's documented." Lena followed. "Mr. Pike, in your professional opinion, was this a misunderstanding?" "No." "What was it?" "A coordinated effort to remove Miss Holloway from ownership prior to liquidation." The words landed heavily. Margaret shifted in her seat for the first time. Then came the recordings. Not all of them, just enough. Daniel's voice calm and confident, discussing timing. Margaret's voice sharp and dismissive, referring to me as manageable. Thomas Renshaw advising signature control. The courtroom was silent. The judge took notes. When it was Daniel's turn, he looked lost. He tried to speak about stress, about pressure, about family expectations. The judge listened, then asked one question. Did you or did you not authorize the use of your wife's signature without her knowledge? Daniel hesitated. Margaret leaned forward. Daniel swallowed. Yes, that was it. Margaret stood up. This is unfair, she snapped. She's twisting everything. My son was trying to protect. Sit down, Mrs. Holloway, the judge said sharply. She didn't. She pointed at me. She was never meant to run that farm. She doesn't understand legacy. The judge's voice dropped. Mrs. Holloway, one more word, and I will hold you in contempt. She sat. I was called last. I stood and swore in my hands, steady. Lena asked simple questions. How long had I run the farm? 8 years. What was my annual revenue at the time of the trust formation? Approximately $1.4 million. Had I ever authorized the transfer of ownership? No. Had I been aware of the affair? Not until after the injunction. How did I respond? I sought legal counsel. No anger, no speeches, just facts. Margaret's attorney tried to provoke me. Isn't it true you were overwhelmed? I smiled faintly. No. Isn't it true you resented your husband's family? No. Isn't it true you're doing this out of spite? I met his eyes. I'm doing this because it's mine. He sat down. The judge recessed for 30 minutes. I stood in the hallway and stared at the floor, not praying, not hoping, just waiting. When we were called back in, the ruling was direct. The trust was voided permanently. Full ownership of the farm restored to me. Damages awarded for financial abuse. Criminal proceedings to continue independently. Margaret's face collapsed in slow motion. Daniel closed his eyes. The judge finished with one final statement. This court does not reward entitlement disguised as stewardship. I exhaled. Outside, snow had started falling. Lena shook my hand. It's done. I nodded. Margaret didn't look at me as she left. She walked past, like I didn't exist. Daniel paused at the door, turned. I never thought you'd fight, he said quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. That afternoon, I went back to the farm and stood in the barn where it had all started. The smell of hay and oil and cold air filled my lungs. I thought about how close I'd come to losing everything because I wanted to believe in people. I didn't regret believing. I regretted not paying attention sooner. But regret is only useful if it changes behavior. And mine had. The next phase of my life wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about control. About deciding who got access and who didn't. About making sure no one could ever quietly rewrite my ownership again. As I locked the barn and walked back toward the house, my phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. We need to talk. This isn't over. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I deleted it. Because for me, it was over. For them, the consequences were just beginning. And in the next chapter, they would learn that losing power is much harder than losing money. Especially when the person you underestimated no longer needs anything from you at all. Winning doesn't feel like relief right away. It feels like standing in a quiet room after a storm, waiting to see what's still broken. The week after the ruling, the farm moved with an unfamiliar ease. No interruptions, no sudden meetings, no voices telling me what was best for me. I signed checks without hesitation. I approved repairs that had been delayed for months. I rehired 2 seasonal workers Daniel had quietly let go to cut costs. Control doesn't announce itself. It settles. Margaret disappeared from town almost immediately. Her house lights went dark. Neighbors said she'd gone to stay with a cousin in Missouri. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Daniel was released on bond 2 days after the hearing. He didn't come back to the farm. He wasn't allowed to. The restraining order was clear. Emily called once. I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on what was left. Lena advised me to think about restructuring, not out of fear, but prudence. You don't rebuild the same house after a fire, she said. You redesign it. So I did. I formed a new operating entity, Holloway Land and Cattle was retired quietly. The name carried too much weight, too much history that wasn't mine. The new company was called Redfield Cooperative. Not a trust, not a shell. A working structure with clear rules and transparency baked into every layer. I retained full ownership. I offered profit sharing to long-term staff. I brought Ruth Calder back on as chief financial advisor on my terms. She accepted with a small smile. "I always knew you'd come into your own," she said. I didn't correct her. I had always been my own. People started stopping me in town, not to ask questions, to apologize. I didn't linger in those conversations. Apologies are private things. Public ones tend to be about easing guilt. One afternoon, I received a certified letter from Margaret's attorney. It wasn't an appeal. It was a request. Margaret wished to recover personal items still stored at the farmhouse: jewelry, photo albums, some furniture. Lena reviewed it. "There's no reason to deny it," she said, "but do it on your schedule." We arranged a supervised pickup. Margaret arrived on a cold morning with a moving truck and a friend I didn't recognize. She didn't look at me when I opened the door. I stepped aside. She moved through the house like it was unfamiliar, touching walls, pausing at doorways. She stopped in the living room. "You changed the curtains," she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "I suppose that's appropriate." She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to. When she left, the house felt lighter. Not because she was gone, because she no longer belonged to it. The criminal case moved forward quietly. No cameras, no drama. Daniel accepted a plea deal 2 months later. Reduced charges, probation, restitution. I wasn't consulted. I didn't need to be. His consequences weren't mine to manage. Emily sent another message, shorter this time. "I'm starting over. I won't bother you again." I believed her, and I let it be enough. The real shift came one evening in early spring. I was reviewing expansion plans when Lena called. "I want you to hear this from me first," she said. "Margaret's filed a civil suit." I closed my eyes. "On what grounds?" "Emotional distress, loss of reputation, interference with family relations." I laughed once, quietly. "She's reaching." "Yes," Lena said, "and she's doing it publicly." That mattered. Margaret wasn't trying to win. She was trying to rewrite. The complaint painted her as a grieving mother, Daniel as a misguided son, me as a cold, opportunistic wife who exploited the system. It was familiar. I read the filing once, then handed it back to Lena. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Lena smiled slightly. "We don't fight her narrative. We dismantle it." The countersuit was surgical. Defamation, malicious prosecution, abuse of process. We attached transcripts, court findings, financial records. No commentary, no emotion. Margaret's case didn't make it past the preliminary hearing. The judge dismissed it with prejudice. In open court. That phrase mattered. With prejudice means you don't get to try again. When the ruling came down, I didn't attend. I was in the field boots, muddy phone in my pocket. Lena left a voicemail. "It's over, Claire. Completely." I stood still for a moment, the wind moving through the grass. Then I went back to work. That night, I cooked dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. No ceremony, no toast, just food and quiet. The next morning, I received an unexpected email from Thomas Renshaw. It was brief. "I made mistakes. I regret my involvement. I hope you'll consider accepting this apology." I forwarded it to Lena. No response, I wrote. "Agreed," she replied. Some doors don't close loudly. They simply stop opening. As spring settled in, the farm thrived. Not because I was proving anything, because it was allowed to function without interference. I hired a new operations manager, a woman named Diane Holt, 45, direct, unimpressed by legacy. She looked over the books and nodded. "You run a clean operation," she said. "People tried to take advantage of that." "Not anymore," I replied. She smiled. "Good." One evening, as I locked up, I caught my reflection in the barn window. I looked older, not worn, defined. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of this, the one who'd tried to smooth things over, to keep peace at the cost of clarity. I didn't judge her. She did what she knew how to do, but she wasn't the one standing here now. And in the next chapter, I would face the last thing I hadn't addressed yet. Not a person, a pattern. Because surviving betrayal isn't just about removing people from your life. It's about making sure you don't rebuild the same dynamic with a different face. That reckoning was quieter and harder, but it was the final step towards something that didn't require vigilance to maintain. Something that finally felt like mine. Patterns don't announce themselves when they return. They feel familiar, comfortable, almost reasonable. That's how I knew something was wrong the moment I felt the urge to explain myself again. It happened at a regional agricultural conference in Wichita. I'd been invited to speak on cooperative land management, a topic I cared about long before any of this happened. I almost declined. Visibility still felt like something to be careful with. But Diane Holt, my operations manager, didn't hesitate. "You should go," she said. "You didn't take the land back just to hide." She was right. The conference hall was packed with people who knew the business, but not my story. That was intentional. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted credibility. I gave my talk. Clear numbers, clean strategy, no personal history. The questions afterward were sharp and respectful. Then I saw her. Margaret Holloway sat in the third row. She hadn't been on the attendee list. I knew because I checked it twice. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, but her eyes were the same, assessing, measuring. She waited until the room thinned before approaching. "Claire," she said like nothing had happened. "You spoke well." I didn't answer right away. She clasped her hands together. "I wanted to clear the air. We've both been through a lot." That phrase again, both. I looked at her carefully, not with anger, with distance. "What do you want, Margaret?" Her mouth tightened. "I think we both know things got out of hand. I've lost my son, my reputation, my place in this community." She waited, expecting reassurance. I didn't give it. She leaned closer. "I'm asking for peace." There it was. Peace to Margaret had always meant control without resistance. I thought about the woman I'd been before, the one who would have softened her voice, offered compromise, apologized for surviving. I didn't do that. Peace isn't something you ask for after you've exhausted every other option, I said calmly. It's something you choose before you hurt people. Her eyes flashed. "You think you're above this now?" I shook my head. "I think I'm done with it," she scoffed. "You'll regret shutting doors like this." I met her gaze steadily. "I regret leaving them open too long." For a moment, something like fear crossed her face. Then she straightened. "You're cold," she said. I smiled faintly. "No, I'm clear." She walked away without another word. My hands were shaking when I sat back down. Not from fear, from adrenaline. Old habits dying hard. That night, back at the hotel, I lay awake, thinking about how easily I'd almost slipped back into explaining myself. That was the pattern, not choosing people who hurt me, but choosing to justify my boundaries to them. The next morning, I made a decision that had nothing to do with Margaret. I stepped down from 2 local boards I'd joined out of obligation. I declined a partnership that felt rushed, even though the numbers were good. I said no to a project that required me to be flexible about authority. Each no felt like muscle memory being retrained. Back at the farm, I gathered the team. "We're setting new boundaries," I told them. "With vendors, with partners, with ourselves." Diane nodded. "Good operations don't run on favors." Exactly. A week later, the local paper ran a follow-up piece on the farm's turnaround. This time, my name was attached to it without qualifiers. No mention of scandal, no family context, just results. That mattered more than I expected. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the fields glowed gold, I sat on the porch and thought about how revenge is usually framed as punishment, as humiliation. as spectacle. What I'd done didn't look like that. I hadn't taken anything from them. I'd stopped letting them take from me. That distinction mattered. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt yourself shrinking to keep others comfortable, take a second to like this, subscribe, or leave a comment. You're not alone in noticing these patterns, even when they wear familiar faces. Emily sent one last message that week. I named the baby Claire. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, I hope she grows up knowing who she is. That was all. I didn't feel closure. I felt continuity. The land outside was steady. The work ongoing. The future no longer tied to reaction. And as I turned off the porch light and went inside, I realized something quietly important. The story everyone else told about me had stopped mattering, because the one I was living finally made sense without explanation. In the next chapter, the last loose thread would pull itself free, not through confrontation, but through absence. And sometimes that's the most decisive ending of all. Absence is louder than people expect. It echoes in places where control used to live. I felt it first in the quiet after the conference, when no one followed up with rumors or warnings or advice. No one asked how I was holding up. No one tried to manage my reaction. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. Spring moved into summer, and the farm expanded in ways that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with intention. Redfield Cooperative signed its first long-term supply contract with a regional distributor based out of Omaha. The numbers were clean, the margins modest, but stable, exactly the kind of growth I trusted. Diane Holt handled negotiations without drama. Ruth Calder audited every quarter without surprises. Systems replaced improvisation. Transparency replaced charm. That was the point. One afternoon, while reviewing lease agreements for an adjacent parcel I planned to acquire, Lena called. "There's been a development," she said. I didn't tense. That alone told me how far I'd come. Daniel violated probation. I closed my eyes briefly. How? Failed to disclose income. Tried to move assets through a third party. I pictured him exactly as he'd always been, reaching for control long after it was gone. The court revoked leniency. Short sentence. County facility. "Do I need to do anything?" I asked. "No," Lena said. "This doesn't touch you." Good. Margaret didn't call. She didn't write. She vanished from every place she'd once dominated. That was the real consequence for her. Not the loss of money, the loss of audience. The town adjusted faster than I expected. People who once avoided eye contact started waving again. Not warmly, not apologetically. Normally, normal felt radical. The only remaining tie I hadn't addressed was the house. The farmhouse had been renovated slowly over the years by people who weren't me. Colors chosen by Margaret. Furniture Daniel insisted on. Rooms arranged for guests I no longer hosted. One Saturday morning, I walked through it, room by room, and realized something simple. I didn't live there anymore. I owned it. I maintained it. But I didn't belong to it, so I listed it. Not publicly at first. Quiet inquiries. Word spread quickly. A family from Colorado bought it within a month. Cash, clean. I didn't attend the closing. Diane handled it. The day they moved in, I stood at the fence line and watched the truck disappear down the road. I felt nothing, which told me everything. I moved into a smaller house on the far edge of the property. One story. Wide windows, no guest rooms. Mine. That night, sitting on the porch with a beer, I barely drank. I thought about how often revenge stories end with confrontation, final speeches, shattered illusions. Mine didn't. It ended with space, with choosing not to orbit people who needed opposition to feel real. If this story has kept you listening, if you've stayed this far, because you recognize the quiet moments more than the loud ones, take a second to like, comment, or subscribe. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because noticing these shifts matters. The next morning, I received a letter forwarded from Lena's office, handwritten, Margaret's handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the counter all day while I worked, while I signed contracts, while I walked the fields, while I lived the life she'd tried to redesign without me. At sunset, I opened it. It was short. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I understand now that I was wrong about you. No excuses, no requests. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Understanding, too, had arrived too late. But it wasn't my responsibility to teach her what she'd refused to see. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, just rest. And as summer settled in, I realized there was only one chapter left to live. Not about them, about what came after survival. About choosing a future that didn't need opposition to feel meaningful. That ending wasn't dramatic, but it was finally mine. And in the next chapter, I would stop telling this story as something that happened to me and start telling it as the moment everything real finally began. There's a moment after conflict ends when you realize how much of your identity was built around endurance. You don't notice it while you're surviving. You notice it when there's nothing left to push against. That's where I was that summer. The farm ran smoothly. Contracts held. Staff stayed. No emergencies. No crises. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt unoccupied, not empty, unassigned. So I did something I'd never allowed myself to do before. I took a week off. No email, no spreadsheets, no contingency plans. Diane handled operations. Ruth had access to everything she needed. I left my phone on the kitchen counter and drove west without a plan. I ended up in New Mexico, high desert, wide skies, places that didn't care who you were before you arrived. I stayed in a small rental outside Taos. No television. One chair on the porch, coffee in the morning, silence in the afternoon. The first 2 days were uncomfortable. I kept thinking I'd forgotten something, that I was falling behind, that someone would need me. No one did. By the third day, I started sleeping late, reading, taking long walks without counting steps or calculating time. I realized how tightly I'd held everything together for years, mistaking vigilance for responsibility. When I came back, something had shifted. I didn't jump back into work at full speed. I observed. Which meetings drained me? Which projects felt aligned? Which conversations required armor? I began removing the latter. A partnership that came with too many opinions. Gone. A board seat that expected free labor masked as prestige. Declined. A vendor who kept forgetting my authority. Replaced. Each decision was small. Together, they rewired my life. One evening, Diane joined me on the porch after a long day. "You're different," she said. I smiled. "Good. Different or concerning?" "Grounded," she said. "Like, you're not bracing for impact anymore." That was it. I'd stopped living like something was about to be taken from me. The last legal loose end resolved quietly in August. The restitution payments were scheduled. The file was closed. Lena called to confirm. "This is officially done," she said. "No appeals, no outstanding motions." I thanked her, then added sincerely, "I couldn't have done this without you." She paused. "You could have. It just would have taken longer." I thought about that. Emily sent a photo once. A newborn, wrapped in a blanket, no caption. I saved it, not because I felt pulled back, because I felt complete enough not to be. That fall, Redfield Cooperative hosted its first open harvest day. Local families, kids climbing hay bales, food trucks parked along the road. No speeches, no press. Just land, doing what land does when it's respected. I watched from a distance, hands in my pockets, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pride, without defensiveness. Later that night, as the last car left, and the lights went out one by one, I sat alone in the quiet. I thought about how revenge is often misunderstood. It isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about removing their access to your future. I hadn't taken anything from Daniel or Margaret. I'd simply refused to keep financing their illusions. That distinction changed everything. If you're still here, if you've walked through this story with me, take a second to like, comment, or subscribe. Not because you owe me anything, but because stories like this matter to the people who are still standing in the middle of theirs, wondering if they're allowed to stop enduring. You are. The last thing I did before turning in that night was write one sentence in a notebook I kept now, not for evidence, but for reflection. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks you control. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. There was one chapter left, not about conflict, about choice. And that choice would be the quietest, strongest thing I'd done yet. The last choice wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no moment where everyone finally understood what they'd done wrong. It was quieter than that. It was the decision to stop waiting for recognition from people who only noticed value when it benefited them. The morning I made that choice, the farm woke up like it always did. Light sliding over the fields, the sound of machinery starting in the distance, cattle shifting patient and indifferent to human drama. I brewed coffee and sat at the small kitchen table in the house I'd chosen, not the one I'd inherited. The windows were open, the air moved freely. For the first time in a long time, nothing felt pending. No court dates, no letters I hadn't opened, no apologies I was secretly hoping for. Just a day. I walked the property later with Diane Holt reviewing plans for the next year. Expansion was steady, intentional. No rush, no pressure to impress anyone. We talked about soil rotation labor schedules, a potential partnership with a neighboring cooperative that had approached us respectfully, with clear terms. When we finished, Diane hesitated. You ever think about selling everything, she asked, starting somewhere new? I considered it honestly. No, I said. Not because I'm attached, because I don't need to escape anymore. She nodded. That makes sense. That was the difference. I wasn't staying out of fear or obligation. I was staying because I chose to. Later that week, I received confirmation that the last restitution payment had been scheduled. It wasn't a large amount in the context of what I'd rebuilt, but it wasn't symbolic either. It was accountability written in numbers. I didn't mark the occasion. I didn't need to. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sky darkened, thinking about how revenge stories are usually told. They end with applause, or regret, or a villain finally broken enough to admit they were wrong. Mine didn't. Daniel never asked for forgiveness. Margaret never truly apologized. Emily stayed at a distance, respectful and unresolved. And that was fine. Closure doesn't come from other people saying the right thing. It comes from no longer needing them to. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of this story. The one who worked herself to exhaustion, trying to prove she was worthy of being included. The one who mistook endurance for loyalty. I didn't feel embarrassed for her. I felt grateful. She survived long enough for me to take over. That night, I wrote another sentence in my notebook. You don't owe access to people who required your silence to feel powerful. The farm quieted around me. Lights went out one by one. The land rested. And so did I. If you've stayed with this story until now, thank you. Truly. If it resonated with you, if it mirrored something you've lived through, or are still living through, take a moment to comment, or subscribe. Not because it helps me, but because it reminds you that these stories don't end in collapse. They end in choice. Here's what I know now. Family isn't proven by blood, or paperwork, or history. Love isn't obedience. Peace isn't something you earn by shrinking. The best revenge isn't humiliation. It's building a life so grounded, that no one can quietly take it from you again. That's where I am now. Not triumphant, not bitter, not waiting, just living. And that's the ending I chose.